They called her just the help. Then he stood up and said her name. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he said. She worked where the saloon's lamplight pooled like syrup on the worn boards, where steam rose from tin mugs in thin curls and the stove hummed its slow, steady song. Her hands could do anything. Mend a rip so fine the thread hid like a memory, patch a saddle with a seam that lasted through 3 winters, stitch a faded ribbon back onto a bonnet until it looked as if it belonged to a girl not yet taught to keep her mouth shut. Her name was Eliza May Callahan, and most afternoons she kept her head down, her fingers moving, and her silence like a measuring line across a life that people figured they'd read at a glance. The town, the sort of place that squatted beneath a long sky, was called Mercy, a name folks repeated with pride, though sometimes their mercies came measured and best with a wagged finger. Mercy had a single street of storefronts and a church with a bell that only rang for Sunday or funerals. The saloon sat close to the post office and the feed shop, its long windows dark in the heat of midday and luminous at dusk when men came in for whiskey and the women who worked their polished spoons and stories at the same time. Eliza's apron had seen better days. It was patched at the hem, and the pocket was frayed where she kept scraps of thread and the last letters of a name she kept folded small in a drawer of the boarding house. She wore it to keep her dresses from being ruined by grease or flour, but it also kept people from seeing what she kept tucked inside. The gentleness that refused to quit, the quiet jokes to herself when no one watched, the soft shame that came each time someone called her help and meant the whole town with it. She had been alone for some years. No husband, no children to steady her mornings. Widow, some whispered. Spinster, said others with pursed lips and a sharp nod. The truth sat patient beneath both versions. There had been a man once, a wash of warm hands and a laugh like wind in new wheat. He had gone away with a fever and never come back. There were nights when Eliza's pillow knew the shape of her loss. There were mornings when she folded it away, as people folded grief into small tidy corners so neighbors wouldn't trip on it. If you looked at Mercy's ledger of gossip, her name took up a neat little box. Plain, steady, keep to yourself. But silence, like soil, holds its own seeds. Eliza's quiet had roots. He arrived in late summer when the grass on the prairie had browned at the edges and the sky refused to tan into anything but a hard, bright blue. He rode a bay mare that looked like it had been carved from the same landscape, solid, sure, and bearing the dust of roads that had no end. He wore a hat that shadowed his eyes and a coat that had an old, map-like saddle smell. People in Mercy saw him and drew the curtains of their assumptions. Another drifter, a man with a past, probably an outlaw because any man who could sit so still under such a sky had to be hiding something dangerous. His name was Jonah Avery. Folks called him the rancher because he bought a spread on the edge of town, a strip of land with a corral and a barn painted a tired red. He moved slow and watched the town with eyes that did not wander, like a man who'd learned not to waste movement. He ate his meals in the back corner of the saloon at first, the place where the lamplight meant less and his coffee stayed hot longer against the wood. It was said he had been a wagon driver, a Confederate scout, a cattle buyer. It was also said he had been none of those things. The truth, like many truths in Mercy, would have to be pried free with patience. Eliza saw him before most did because she saw more than people allowed themselves. She saw him lift a tin mug to his mouth with a hand that was calloused but careful. She saw the way he never looked at his boots when he spoke to the barkeep, as if he had learned to hold his gaze and not look away from the world that might still need him. She saw the scar at the corner of his lip that tightened when his jaw worked around a thought. There was something in his steadiness, a quiet that answered hers. On a Wednesday when the air held the brittle edge of fall, the saloon filled with the town's usual chorus. Mugs clinking, cards sliding, a piano that tried to be happy and mostly failed. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Langford, came in with a rustle and a scowl that suited her like a proper winter coat. She had a way of speaking that landed with an extra weight, like the kind of coin that could sink a reputation if thrown at a person. She saw Eliza, standing by the stove, a towel over her arm, steam on her face. Mrs. Langford's mouth tightened. "There she is," she said loud enough for the men to turn. "Still in the back, Eliza? Your place is." Useful, she smiled with teeth that shined like a sermon about duty. We're all glad someone keeps the pots warm. Something in the room leaned forward. The hat brims tipped. Eliza kept working. Her hands trembled only a little when she set the kettle down. A hiss like breath escaping. She felt the shame rise. The hollow, hot shame that had visited since the day the letters came that said her man was gone. She lifted her chin and kept stirring. Shame has a voice that hollers. Kindness has a hand that softens. Eliza practiced giving that hand even when others would not. The small-town shamer moved like a cloud of frost. She pointed at a seam where Eliza had mended a coat for an old farmer, then at the hem that had been sewn on a Sunday to hide a tear in a woman's dress. "You always know which thread to pull on, Eliza," she said, not subtle. "Funny how your fingers do what mouths won't. Sometimes wonder if you've ever had a proper home," the men snorted. A young clerk, who ate his lunch like an accusation, said something about keeping wages neat. Laughter rolled, small and cruel. Jonah watched. He had been quiet when Mrs. Langford spoke to others in the room, but when her words slid across the thin line to Eliza, his chair creaked like a breaking twig and he stood. He did not stride like someone meant to rectify all wrongs with swift fists. He stood because there are some things a man cannot watch without his chest tightening, and his chest tightened then. "Mrs. Langford," he said, his voice low as a drawbar being unwound. "I reckon there's more to a person than the way she scrubs plates." Conversation hushed. The piano halted mid-sigh. Even the bartender paused with a rag that had been in use since noon. Jonah didn't say it loudly. He didn't rage. There was a kind of law in his voice that insisted on small justice. "Eliza's stitches keep folks walking when their hems give out. That's worth more than a sermon about decency." Mrs. Langford's eyebrows drew like a bowstring. "And what do you know of work, Mr. Avery? You just arrived." He looked at her then, the lamplight cutting his face into two zones. He didn't name himself a stranger or an intruder. He simply said, "Maybe I've been around a fire, seen what folks need." Then his gaze traveled to Eliza. It saw the worn apron, the resilience braided into her shoulders, the way she had steadied herself for years like a ship at anchor. "And I know if I had to mend my jacket or my kid's coat, I'd rather see her hands on my thread than any of yours." That was like a net being thrown across the room. The prejudice snagged. A man who kept to himself has a different kind of armor. He used it now as shield and recognition. The men scattered like leaves rustled by a tentative wind. Mrs. Langford's lips thinned to a line of condemnation that didn't find support. She left the saloon with the dignity of someone who believed herself blameless, even as the silence behind her made her carriage creak. Eliza felt something loosen inside like a knot finally letting go. Her hands had been busy enough to hide how breathless she had grown when scorn slipped into the room. Jonah's words did not heal every small cut. They were not sweeping or grand. They were a chair being offered beside a person who had been standing for too long. She tried to look as unmoved as she could, a mask she had practiced for years. But when his gaze met hers, there was a warmth that moved beneath the years of quiet. It took the shape of a small, private acknowledgement. She lowered her hand to the towel and turned the kettle by its handle as if nothing unusual had happened. In Mercy, kindness often showed up as private acts folded into public days. Eliza lived by that code. Milk for a neighbor's calf left on a doorstep at dawn. A jar of pickles slid into a widow's pantry. A mended strap braided onto a boy's satchel so he could fetch water without being mocked. People stole these silences as if they were delicate things. The more she gave, the more she hid. It saved the town while it hollowed her. The incident in the saloon shifted something between Jonah and Eliza. It started with a look and slid into small gestures. He began to leave sacks of corn near the boarding house without fanfare, not asking for thanks. He would ride into town and tip the hat that had a notch in the brim toward her, a small ordinance of recognition. When Eliza took a bundle of stitches out to the barn to pass the time with the men who mended fences, he would linger by the corral and speak about the weather like two people flipping open an old map. Their conversations were few, soft, the kind that land on a person like seeds. Nothing loud, but meant to root. One summer afternoon, a woman came into the saloon whose face was clouded by a thin, wild look. She was a mother from the next settlement over with a daughter fever-stricken, and she had traveled miles in a wagon that coughed and wheezed. "My girl," she whispered to Eliza. "Her fever won't fall. We have not a pittance left." Eliza saw the ragged sleeve, the way the woman's hands were raw from the rains. She swallowed a habit of keeping pockets tight and sent her into the room to sit by the stove. She wrapped the child in a blanket from the back and brewed the bitterest tea she had, adding a pinch of hope that had been saved for emergencies. The woman wept without sound. "Can't pay much," she said finally, the words falling like coins she didn't mean to spend. "Only this." She pushed forward a small locket with a faded photograph inside. A girl who looked like she had not yet learned the curve of sorrow. Eliza felt the old, familiar tug at the pocket where she kept pens and thread. She took the locket and closed it in a hand that had learned to hold small, breakable things with care. There are acts of kindness that cost nothing and those that cost everything. Sewing a button on a coat cost a few stitches. Lifting a child's fever took hours and the willingness to stand watch all night, offering warm cloths and cool spoons, talking to a fevered mind like a map reader tracing the edges of a known country. She sat by the child's cot and hummed an old tune. She fanned the little one, pressing a cool cloth to a hot brow and whispering a name that belonged to the lullaby. The night outside settled with its usual chorus, crickets and the distant lowing of cattle, and Eliza's breath kept time with the child's. Dawn came and the fever broke like a brittle branch. The mother clung to Eliza with gratitude that made the seamstress feel both lighter and oddly exposed. "How will I pay you?" the woman asked. Eliza shook her head. "You paid in sleep," she said. "That's enough then," because she could not bear for their pockets to be empty on the path home. She slipped the locket into the woman's palm. "Keep her photo. It will keep your hands warm." Word drifted across Mercy as it does with old smoke. Where Eliza had spent a night mending a child's fever, people began to murmur with a different cadence. She had been small kindness for the needy for years, but there was something about an all-night watch that made the town consider this quiet woman in a new light. Jonah heard of it and came by the saloon when the light had drained out of the day. He sat at Eliza's table without a fuss and handed her a cup of coffee that still steamed. "You're getting blamed and praised in equal measure, Eliza May," he said. She looked at him like a person who had been seen and still felt the ache of being known. "I don't keep books, Mr. Avery," she said. "I keep hands busy." He laughed softly, a sound like gravel being turned in a palm. "That's a ledger with better entries than most I've seen." Their relationship threaded through Mercy with a quiet, like a river that had cut a new channel. Not everything that passes between two people needs declarations. They found a language in the small. Shared silence over a broken fence, Jonah slipping a loaf to Eliza from a burlap sack, Eliza patching a tear in his jacket until the patch sat like a badge. He told her, once, about riding across open land where the stars made the sky a canvas. He said little about the past because he did not want to drop it like a stone into their pond and watch the circles keep coming. But Mercy is a place where stories are currency, and the ledger is never closed. The small-town shamer, Mrs. Langford, could not abide the slow shift of people's affections. To her, Eliza's acts were not proof of worth but of cunning. If someone stole the town's adoration without her stamp, she reasoned, it must be deceit. She began to turn her scrutiny toward Jonah, too, because a man of reserve who'd chosen to take up residence beside a woman the town had previously overlooked was a provocation. She whispered to the minister on a cold morning about strange men with strange pasts and suspicious kindnesses. She did not call it malice. She framed it as moral concern. "One never knows what lingers in a man's shadow," she told the minister, whose hands wept over him books and who preferred to file his worries in neat columns. "And what of a woman who draws him out?" He did not think it his place to probe, but rumor finds allies in lonely souls. If you want trouble in a small town, you need only let suspicion sit long enough to sour into certainty. Mrs. Langford's words collected like mud and splashed across the town's clean dresses. "I saw John Avery ride late at night toward the feed barn with a lantern," said a man at the post office. Perhaps he's making late deals. I watched Eliza leave with a basket to his house, said another. There's more between them than mending. One autumn evening, when the wind had the bite of coming winter and the sky was a flat pewter, Mrs. Langford organized a meeting at the church. It was advertised as a discussion about propriety and the danger of loose living in mercy. People came because the church door was of a moral grade that made attendance feel like voting. They filed in and sat like a chorus of judgment. The minister read a scripture about watchfulness, his voice the kind that makes words feel heavier and more binding. Mrs. Langford rose with a firmness that was practiced. We must guard our town, she said. Her words found soft hands to clasp. We must ensure that the lines of decency are not blurred. The implication was not subtle. Decency had a color and a clean hem, and it was not meant to be shared with those who kept to the back. The room nodded. The resolution was made, as resolutions are in places that love certainty. They would watch the interactions, keep the neighborhood on the lookout, make a record of what folks were doing. It was a vigilance wrapped in polite language. The next week, someone pounded on the boarding house door. Eliza! The voice was a pincer, firm and public. She opened the door to find Mrs. Langford on the stoop with two other women, the air between them as sharp as a knife. They flung accusations about impropriety, about the kind of favors a woman might do for a man whose pockets you hadn't counted. They asked to inspect her rooms, to see if they might find letters or proof of lawless things. The town's zeal for propriety had become a siege. Eliza's chest did what it had done since the day she learned to let grief live quietly. It tightened. She had been careful. Her rooms told a simple story. One cot, a cracked mirror, a chest with a few garments and the remnants of fine thread. There was no scandal to be found. Only the quiet life of someone who mended and kept to herself. The women left dissatisfied, their eyes hunting for specks. When Jonah heard the commotion, he came without a swagger. He came with the steady grit of someone who'd returned from a long road and could not stand to see a person trodden. He stood beside Eliza on the boarding house stoop and pointed at the women who had come to judge. You'll say what you will, he said, his voice like a plow turning up a field. But I'll not let a woman be paraded like the town's entertainment. There was a hush so thick people could hear the horse at the edge of town whinny in the night. Mrs. Langford sputtered righteous words about decency. She tried to marshal public support in the form of gossip. But Jonah's presence altered the tenor like rain on dust. He did not offer a sermon. He offered an ordinary, undeniable thing. Steadfastness. Eliza's not your entertainment, he said. She's not for you to trade in looks or gossip. And if you have a complaint beyond your own reflection, bring it proper like, or hold your tongue. It was less a rescue than a placing of a hand over a small fire. The town simmered with a mix of relief and resentment. Some people felt their moral world had been rattled, like a chair pulled from beneath them. Others felt vindicated, like a dusting cloth finally finding a corner to clean. Eliza felt something close to awe and a deep, steady gratitude that didn't know how to be confessed. She would not be swept up by words. She'd learned early that gratitude could come with its own shame. She met Jonah's gaze and found the quiet warmth she had been gathering, like an ember someone had not starved. Not everyone in mercy accepted Jonah's presence. Rumors about his past lingered like smoke that refuses to find a chimney. One evening a stranger arrived, a man with an easy smile and a penchant for whiskey. He ordered a drink and asked pointedly about Jonah Avery. He's an outsider, the man said to whoever would listen. Anybody who wanders in with thin answers is likely to have a pocket full of old trouble. People's imaginations are hungry things. They will fill in your history for you if you let them. The man's questions were cheap and heavy, and the answers he sought were not meant to be given. Jonah kept his own counsel about his past. On some days he would sit on his porch with a sack of seed, and any neighbor who cared to pass a moment would stop and talk about the weather or the price of oats. He told a story once about a place where the river bent like a lover's elbow, and a girl had worn a white dress that always threatened mud. He told it like a man who had loved and lost and had come out on the other side like a man who'd carried heavy things. He left out the names that might have summoned ghosts. Eliza's life continued in the rhythm that had come to be expected. Dawn mending, noon serving soup, night sewing by lamplight. But the small kindnesses she offered began to be recognized publicly. People who had once looked at her like a fixture now paused to thank her. A child would run with a note to say thanks for a patched coat. An old farmer would tip his hat as he passed, more carefully than before. It didn't erase the time she was mocked. Those were like the weather, unpredictable and somewhat inevitable. But they became less sharp, because someone else, steady as a fence post, had placed himself beside her. All of this would have been a quiet tide if not for the day when the town's old scandal found a new voice. The stranger, the whiskey man, stayed long enough for a rumor to harden into a public accusation. He claimed Jonah had been an outlaw, that his quiet was a winter of hiding, and that Eliza had been his confederate in a string of thefts that had happened on dusty roads years ago. The man produced scraps of paper, a letter here, a name mentioned there, like a tailor fitting accusations into a cloth. Mrs. Langford's eyes shone with righteousness, and the town's gossip found a backbone. They called for a meeting in front of the bank, the place that doubled as a town hall on days when the sun was high and people had engines to run. The lists of accusations were read aloud. A community theater of suspicion. Jonah did not speak at first. He listened like one who felt a slow, rising ache at being measured by other people's maps. Then Eliza stepped forward. She had a look about her like people give a flag when something they love is in danger. Not polished but steady. The crowd hissed and made a space. The small-town shamer posted herself at the front like an executioner. "It's clear what's happened," she said. "They're not what they pretend." Eliza felt the familiar churn, humiliation, anger, the old song. But she also felt another layer, one of the hard-won courage she'd collected stitch by stitch. She did not shout. She did not cry out for fairness with a voice that demanded applause. She leaned forward and said, slowly, "If you have proof, show it. Don't drag a man's life out because you're hungry for spectacle." Her words landed like a hand on a rough beast. The whiskey man, who had practiced the art of accusation, shuffled his papers and tried to make the case. But Jonah had quietly done something the town did not expect. He had asked for a fair hearing at the sheriff's office and had produced files that told a different story. There had been a fight in his life that ended badly, but not by his hand. The accusations that curled into the air were ugly, yes, but they were also tangled in old law and older cruelty. Jonah had paid for what he was owed with long work and small penances, and he had no desire to hide what he had done. He stood tall and spoke plainly. "Once, I took a path that led me wrong," he admitted. His voice did not seek sympathy. It sought to show truth like a map so the town might decide what to do with it. "I paid what I owed. I don't want your pity. I want your honesty." Honesty landed like a new harvest on the town's conscience. People started to murmur in different ways. Some still clung to the old suspicion because mistrust is thick and slow to slide. Others, who had known Jonah only by rumor, found their ideas shifting. Mrs. Langford stepped back, displeased that her sermon had been answered not by shame but by a man who would not be reduced. The climax of Mercy's public trial came when a woman whose wagon had broken years ago spoke up. She remembered Jonah in a different way. He had fixed a wheel for her, not for praise but because a child's cry met the night. She remembered hands that had been there. Another man who had once been saved from a barbed wire tangle said Jonah had helped him without asking. Slowly, like a line of dominoes tipped toward sense, the town's judgment reshaped. Shame loosened its fingers. The day after the storm of accusations, Jonah rode out to where the river ran like an old friend. He sat under the cottonwoods and came apart a little, but not in the way a man who had never known sorrow might. He took a breath that smelled of water and seed and said the name of someone the town had thought him to hide. He told the river, because rivers keep secrets gently, about the time he'd been part of a terrible choice and had since set the rest of his life to repay it. He did not ask forgiveness for himself. He asked grace for the path that had been rough and for the person who had stayed kind through it all. Eliza found him there because she had a way of tracing people who had a need for quiet talk. She sat beside him without preface. They didn't speak for a long time. The river said 1,000 things by itself. Jonah told her, in fits and starts, about the years he'd rowed, of smoke and men who took easier paths than him, of the ledger of regret he'd kept by lamplight. He did not make a confession that demanded absolution. He simply set it beside him like a tool he'd pick up later if it served. "You never left," Eliza said. Her voice was small but full. Meaning in mercy had always been earned by steady presence. "You came back." He looked at her, and the light in his eyes was like someone watching a brand but not yet touching it. "I came back to see if I could do better." They sat like two people who had been walking toward each other all their lives. There was no sudden rush, no dramatic embrace. Romance in mercy did not explode. It folded in like a letter grammar had taught you. Careful, filled with margin notes, meaningful in each line. Jonah reached over and took Eliza's hand, his palm rough and surprisingly warm. She did not pull away. Her fingers fit into his like a habit returning. A new rhythm came to their days. Jonah worked the land in a way that was quiet and purposeful. Eliza kept her sewing basket but now traveled out to his barn with warm pies and mending done with the delicacy of a person who knew which thread held. People watched them from shaded windows and judged less and noticed more. Mercy's gossip softened into a background hum. One night in late winter when the wind wore a comet's edge and the moon made everything a little too honest, a group of men came to the Avery Ranch with teeth around an accusation. They were led by the whiskey man, emboldened by a night of other people's talk. They wanted payment for a debt a town had not quite forgiven. Jonah met them on the porch with hands that were steady and eyes that had seen too much to be rattled easily. He did not ask for trouble. He did not beg for understanding. "You'll not take what's not yours," he said. His voice was as level as a field. The whiskey man stepped forward, and the tone turned toward the physical. Men who have saved hostility like tinder do not always consider the cost of fire. Jonah did not seek to inflame. He offered facts. The whiskey man grew angrier. Words like knives were thrown. The fight that followed was not a thunderstorm and it was not a tragedy. It was a measurement of two men's lives in the space of a few sharp moves. Jonah did not strike to harm. He moved instead to disarm. It was not brute force but a kind of salvage, quick, controlled, the way someone might corral a wild steer without breaking it. When the men left, bruised and shamed, the whiskey man's threats whistling into the night like bad weather, mercy exhaled in a way it had not in months. Jonah had not sought to ruin the men. He had only kept his ground so that Eliza's place would be safe. It was a defense born of care rather than a need to dominate. It changed how people saw Jonah. He was no longer only a man with a past. He was a man who would step into a fray for someone he loved. The scene at the porch became a story to tell by stove glow. People added small details, and some took the liberty of sharpening Jonah into a hero they wished to have had all along. The accuracy of rumor matters less than the desire for a clean narrative. But more importantly for Eliza, it was an act of recognition. There are words that a person can survive being called. There are also acts that make survival sweet. Jonah's presence at that moment was one of those acts. Months rolled like a cart's wheel. Mercy settled into a new cadence. The town's moral compass, once tilted, righted itself not by lecture but by the slow, steady practice of people showing up for one another. Mrs. Langford grumbled from her pews and admonished her neighbors. She did not succeed in undoing the affection that people had learned for Eliza and Jonah. She found, in the end, that her sermons had less bite than they once did. Mercy had chosen a different story. In spring, when the grass remembered green and the barn swallow returned, Jonah and Eliza started a habit of walking the ridge road at dusk. They spoke about small things and sometimes about the dangerous areaways, the halves of themselves they hadn't shown the world. Jonah asked about the man who had been Eliza's husband and she told him some pieces. A laugh like lightning, a promise that had been carried off on fever wings, but she did not ask him to fill the empty space with his own ghosts. Jonah, in turn, told stories of roads and a past that had been long and heavy. They traded confessions like socks by the fire. Practical, warm, not meant for display. Their relationship was not built out of dramatic declarations. It was a meticulous weaving, Jonah seating himself in the spaces where Eliza needed help without taking the seams she had mended as his to alter. Eliza giving Jonah shelter in a way that did not demand he vanish his past but allowed it room to be. She sewed him a scarf for winter, and he found the way to fix the rickety fence that had irked the neighbor for years. They held things for each other, small and significant. Mercy watched with the cautious approval of a town that loves the safe arc of a story told on a front porch. On an afternoon when the light had that particular softness that makes people confess to the grass, Eliza sat Jonah down on the steps of the barn. She had a handkerchief in her lap and a look like someone who measured her words before letting them air. The way she spoke to him was not the way she spoke to a stranger or to anyone who wanted a spectacle. It was the voice reserved for an altar the two of them had built in silence. "You make me feel less invisible," she said. The admission had the humble weight of someone naming a personal miracle. Jonah looked at her with eyes older than the days they'd spent together could make them. "You're not invisible to me," he said simply. She swallowed. "There are nights," she admitted, "when I hear their laughter like a hitching sound and I wonder if it'll ever stop." She laid her fingers on the hand he'd placed on his knee. "Your presence keeps the laughter from sounding like an end." He touched his hat like a man admitting a truth. "You do more for people than you think. We all wear the town's reckonings differently." He hesitated. "I wasn't sure I could belong here, but you made belonging feel less like a thing to earn and more like a thing to sit in." The words were not fireworks. They were like a table being built. Solid, necessary, offering a place for things to rest. They were the kind of confessions men and women made in places where they needed trust more than grand promises. They sat for a while, not speaking, their silence warmed by a new knowledge. They were both, finally and quietly, acknowledged. Time is as steady as the seasons in mercy. Months grown into a year and then another. Life's smallnesses. Teeth pulled, calves born, rain that fell when it should not, continued to shape them. The boarding house got quieter, and the saloon had more evenings where the piano hummed a softer tune. Jonah's ranch prospered in a way that was not flashy but honest. Eliza's hands did good work, and people came to the saloon to have their hems mended, and to hear the woman who could stitch a sorrow into something that would endure. One evening in late summer, when the night smelled like cut grass and something soft in the air read like promise, Jonah invited Eliza to his porch for a supper of beans and cornbread. The meal was plain and good. They ate by lantern light, the barn casting long, patient shadows that made everything look like an oil painting. Jonah took a breath that had the gravity of a man who had weighed his intentions. He pulled from his pocket an old, hand-carved box, no larger than his palm. Inside, there were two small things. A ring made not of gold but of hammered silver, plain as a wedding band, and a small note he had written, words folded like a confession. He slid them across the table. "I don't have much," he said, "but I have some form of decency left, and enough hands to build one more life. If you'll have it, Eliza May. If you'll sit in a porch beside me and keep being the kind of person who keeps other people from falling, then take this, not as claim but as promise." Eliza held the ring like she held a needle, with reverence for what it meant and humility for how small it was in the face of a big heart. She did not gasp or faint. Mercy did not favor theatrics. She looked at Jonah, at the man who had been quiet and steady enough to be trust itself, and she smiled in a way that made her eyes shine. It was not a smile that wiped the past clean. It was a smile that said, simply, "I'll stand here with you." They married in the spring, in front of a few people who'd watched compassion grow in a town that sometimes needed proof. Mrs. Langford, begrudging and tidy, came because a church chair is heavy, and because the minister had a way about him that made attendance feel like duty. The ceremony was brief, more a joining of work gloves than a pageant. In Mercy, the real work of marriage was not in degrees of affection but in the companionship that raises a roof or steadies a plow. The seasons rolled, and Mercy softened into a better, quieter version of itself. People began to leave small things on the steps of the Avery Ranch. Jars of preserves that said thank you in their way, a calf born healthy that a farmer wanted to brag about, a boy who had learned to mend his own broken boot. The town's scold became a private figure who muttered from behind curtains, because whatever wrath possessed her had less effect when a whole town decided kindness fit them better. Years later, when the barn was mended and the pair had a small stretch of land that bore the quiet evidence of their joined labor, Eliza found a letter tucked into a drawer that had been left unread for too long. It was from the man who had been once her husband, written in a hand that belonged to the man who had been and was not. It told of the fever that had taken him, of the grief he had intended to bring with him, of the life he had wished she'd find. The letter was a small, careful thing. It gave names to ghosts and offered up the last courtesy of telling her he had loved her once. It did not demand response. Eliza sat on the porch steps and read it until the twilight had a color like old paper. Jonah sat beside her and listened as she read aloud, not in sorrow but like someone who reads a map of a land they've already crossed. When she finished, she folded the letter as if she would keep it safe and burned no bridge with the past. It was a closure not dramatic but necessary. For Mercy, the story of Eliza and Jonah became not legend but a lesson. People told the tale at suffrage meetings and at Sunday dinners, not as a morality play but like a truth. People can be redeemed not by spectacle but by the steadiness of good acts. If you saw yourself in her, the town sometimes said, then remember to be kind. The phrase hung like a new sort of prayer. Years later, when winter had traced silver lines on the barn and the couple's hair bore more white than black, they sat on the porch and watched the town pass. A boy ran by with a patched coat and a girl with a bonnet waved. Mercy kept living in small, repeating cycles. Jonah looked at Eliza with that patient affection that grows when two people have shared the unglamorous bits of life for a long time. You laugh more than you used to, he said. So do you, she replied. They laughed. The sound was like a kettle unquiet because it woke things inside them. Laughter, they both discovered, is a salve that can't be measured in stitches. It heals in the way a warm blanket does when you've been out in the cold. Eliza's hands were softer now, not from lack of work but from a life diluted with tenderness. People still needed her stitches. Children grew into adults who remembered her as a lady who mended more than clothing. Jonah's past, which had once been a gnarled tree in the middle of the town's lane, had been reduced to a stump grown over by new green. On an evening that smelled of rain and cookies cooling, when the wind had grown contemplative and the lamplight made their chairs less lonely, Jonah turned to Eliza in a way that felt like the opening of a book you'd been saving to read aloud. He reached across the small table and took her hand. You ever think, he asked, that the town might have been different if someone else had done what you did? He thumbed the hem of her apron, something he'd never been permitted to touch before out of respect. She considered it. Mercy was full of might-have-beens. Maybe, she said, but I think the right work is the work you do when nobody's looking. That's where roots get set. Jonah nodded and seemed to make a decision then. He cupped her hand like a man giving something precious its measure. Then let us be quiet troublemakers, he said, smiling. For as long as we can. She laughed, the sound light and full. Quiet troublemakers, she agreed. They laughed because the phrase was true and ridiculous and everything they'd ever hoped for and never dared to ask. Laughter in Mercy was not something to be scorned. It was a small and powerful hymn. And then there was a moment, a soft one that belonged to the private ledger of a life. Jonah leaned forward and, with a tenderness the town had watched grow, he said two words that were the size of a promise. You matter. It was not a grand proclamation. It was a statement released like a seed into the air. Eliza felt it land in her like rain. Her eyes stung with the warmth of tears she did not always allow. She kept the dignity learned from years of being judged and also let herself be changed. Your laughter, she said, heals wounds I thought would never close. They sat in that simple confession as if it were made of glass. Around them the town went on. People in Mercy kept living, wearing their good and nothing so good as necessary. The saloon doors creaked open and closed. Boots struck floorboards. Horses whinnied in the distant hills. A kettle somewhere hissed and a wind sighed through cracked windows. These were Mercy's rhythms. the sounds that had been the backdrop for years and were likely to remain. At the end of the day, when lamplight slanted over the porch and the barn's shadow fell long and sure, Eliza and Jonah sat in rocking chairs and let the quiet do its work. They had both been humiliated and both had been redeemed in ways neither had at first imagined. Their story was a slow burn, not a flash. It was service to one another, small acts, a town that learned to look a little closer. If you saw yourself in her, if the story sat like a hollow you recognized, remember this. Some roots grow in silence and some people offer their hands, not to take but to steady. Mercy was a town that learned that for itself, inch by patient inch. They would, in time, be the sort of people the town told stories about around an oven door. Not because they were spectacular, but because, in their steadiness, they taught a place how to do better. They taught Mercy that kindness could be loudest when it was least showy, that a man with a past does not have to be his worst story, and that a woman who keeps to the back may be the only one who knows how to stitch a community back together. And that's how a whisper changed a town.